When I was a teenager, I got a seasonal job at a Six Flags amusement park. It was sort of the big employer in our area, which I guess shouldn't be a surprise. However, it was only open during the spring, summer, and early fall, which made it a perfect place for high school students to get their jobs at. Now, this was a long time ago. I don't know if Six Flags operates now like they did back then, but back then at closing time, they did this thing called the security sweep. The entire park was basically just a big circle, so to the right of the entrance, the security guard would sweep around the park, basically forcing the customers, or guests as we were supposed to call them, but I think it's rude to charge guests admission, counterclockwise around the park, right back to the entrance. The only reason I bring this up to you is to explain what it was like when I worked there. I just happened to work at this ice cream parlor, which was the absolutely last place in the counterclockwise sweep to be reached by the security and customers. So, because the park also wants to make as much money as they can, we were the absolute last to close as well. After closing, we still had to clean too. Plus, I had a drawer I had to take down to the cash drawer. I was for sure one of the last people to leave the park at night, and unlike others who worked in the store with me, I didn't have a car. I had to walk to the dressing room, change out of the clothes, and then walk all the way out to the back of the park to the bus stop. If you've never been in a big place like Six Flags after close, you probably don't know just how creepy it can be when you're there all by yourself, but at least you know for sure that you're in a huge and relatively safe space. Not only is it really difficult for someone to break into an amusement park, there's security there at all times. Even the employee parking lot was caged in. But for the employees such as myself who took the bus to work, we had to walk through a small back area to a bus stop with only a small bench and light. Very few bus riders worked at night though, because the buses in the area did not run any later than 7 p.m. And that probably makes you wonder why I was a closing employee. Well, it was the only hours they would give me. So, when I was done, I would go out and call my stepdad on the telephone. He would usually be sleeping at the time, but he would come and pick me up and take me home before going back to bed. This was a very late night during the summer. I can't remember exactly when it was, but the park was late getting closed that day. Tons of people rushed right into the ice cream parlor at the end. We were busier than we were any other time of day. Once the park closed, they sent me to the money counting station. Then I still had to come back and get everything cleaned up. It was easily 2 o'clock in the morning by the time I finally finished and got changed and got out of the park. I called my stepdad, and he told me that he was on his way. So I began walking out of the employee parking area so I could head over to the bus stop. It was creepy as hell because there was no one in the locker room whilst I was there. And there were also no cars in the parking lot. To be in such a huge area, normally teeming with people, and for it to be so empty and silent, it was unlike anything I can explain. I walked down the sidewalk to the bus stop. It was nothing more than a bench with one of those wind and rain guards on it. It was a dim light in the little cubby or whatever. I sat down on the bench and waited. The park was only about a 15-minute drive away from my house, and that was around the time that it took for my stepdad to get there and pick me up usually. So I waited. The normal amount of time had passed, but my stepdad didn't show up. I didn't think too much about it at first. A few minutes here and there was nothing. I'm going to try and explain how this worked. The bus stop was not down on the regular road. To get to it, you have to turn off the road into the back of the park. The road went slowly up the hill, stopping in a circle, right where the bus stop was. So in plain terms, there was no reason for anyone to be in that area unless they were coming to work at the park. More time passed by, and my stepdad still hadn't shown up yet. He may have been a little late once or twice, but as more and more time kept passing, I started to get worried that he still hadn't shown up yet. This was in the early 1990s, so I didn't have a cell phone. The payphone I used to call him was in the locker room. I wouldn't be able to get back in there, because the door I exited was now locked. I had no avenue to call him and see why he hadn't arrived yet. All I could do was sit there and wait until he showed up. After waiting for a little while, looking down the road absent-mindedly, I noticed something a little bit strange. I could see a figure walking up the sidewalk, slowly towards the bus stop. At first, the figure was something I could barely make out. I mean, it wasn't really a long road, but it was extremely dark. Although I thought it was very weird that someone was out there walking so late, I didn't really put a lot of thought into it. But the more I kept waiting for my stepdad to show up, the more attention I began to pay to the figure now walking towards me. I noticed that it was moving pretty slowly. He was also limping as he walked closer and closer. He was wearing this long, dirty trench coat, even though it was very hot outside. I didn't really want to stare at him, but it was just such an odd sight. When he got under some light finally, he looked even stranger to me. I mean, he may have been a homeless guy, and I guess he passed as one if he didn't. I watched as he stopped and picked up a handful of gravel from the side of the road. What the hell was this guy doing? As he got closer to the bus stop, I watched him make a sudden movement. I wasn't sure what that movement was meant to be, until something hard hit the glass on the side of the bus stop. He had thrown a large rock at it. I jumped. The rock nearly struck me. "Hey, stop that!" I yelled. "You almost hit me!" He got closer and threw once again. This time the rock smacked me right in the forehead. It broke the skin and was incredibly painful. I ran behind the bus stop as he began pelting rocks at me. As he got closer, I realized he was wearing a rubber mask he had likely had from a part of a Halloween costume. He kept throwing rocks and hitting the glass. Then, I saw him draw something that looked like a knife out of his jacket pocket, and I felt my blood turn cold. The guy was distracted, though, because a set of headlights began coming up the road. I noticed it was my stepdad in his pickup truck. The guy turned around and looked at the truck. Then he dropped the leftover rocks and took off through the trees by the side of the road. My stepdad finally showed up to pick me up. I jumped in the truck and told him to drive right away. He asked me what had happened, and I explained the situation to him while we drove off. It was such a surreal experience, I wasn't sure if it even really happened. I found out later my stepdad had accidentally fallen back to sleep after waking up. He apologized for me, but it didn't really matter too much. I was just glad he arrived in time to help me. When I got out of high school, I didn't go to college straight away. I wanted to take some time off first. My parents did have a rule, though, that if you weren't in school, then you at least needed to get a job. I had never had a job before, but my older brother was the manager of a bakery in a Piggly Wiggly grocery store. He was able to use some connections to get me a job working in that bakery. I can't tell you that I exactly loved the job, but it did have its perks. I hated getting up in the middle of the night to go to work though, but because the store didn't open until 7 a.m. and I got in at 2, plus it was a really small bakery, I would be the only person in the store for several hours. That part I liked, even though it could be a little bit creepy. I got to work a little bit early on the night this story takes place. I had to make donuts before I did other things in the bakery. Overall, a pretty normal night. I got to the store, unlocked the door, and went inside to get ready for work. I made sure to lock the door behind me. Now, the lights in the entire store were out. The only ones that I ever turned on were the ones that were in the break room on the side of the store, and the one in the bakery. Other than that, the entire store remained dark. I had just arrived and not been in the store for a very long time at all, when things began to get a little bit weird. I was by the donut fryer, when I heard what sounded like some sort of yelp. With the store being empty, this yelp echoed across the entire building. I froze when I was working on the donuts. I was supposed to be the only person in the store right now. I looked at the clock to confirm, and it wasn't even 2:20 a.m. yet. I began wondering if maybe the people from the meat department had come in early as well. They were the only people in the store who could have gotten into the place without me knowing about it. They had the keys to the door in the back of the store, and that might be how they would get in. I wondered if I should have just assumed it was the meat department, and went on with doing my donut work. But then there were a couple of problems with that. First of all, of course, I didn't know for sure. Second, the yelp could have been from someone crying out in pain or in need of help. I decided to go and check it out and see where the noise had come from. The bakery was in the front right corner of the store. The entrance to the meat department was in the back left corner of the store. And of course, between the two places, there were aisles and aisles of product that one definitely couldn't see over in order to know if anyone was in the store. I walked down the front. I planned to go to the far left aisle and then walk to the back of the store. That way I would have a view all the way to the back while I was walking down the aisle. As I walked around the front of the store, I felt very nervous. Walking past each aisle, I prepared myself to jump as I was expecting to possibly see someone wandering around in them. I was relatively positive though that I was just freaking myself out, as I had a tendency to do sometimes. The rational explanation for the noise was that someone in the meat department had come in early and cut themselves or something. That was what would make the most sense. When I got to the final aisle, I turned and expected to see someone there, but there was no one there. I stared across at the swinging door that led to the back, where the meat department was. I have to admit I was very, very nervous, and again, I truly wish I could explain it to you. It wasn't just fear that I was having that particular morning. It was mounted upon the nervousness that I felt every time that I was in the huge store all by myself. I decided that the best thing to do was to just get it over with as quick as possible. I began walking to the back. Once I got to the end of the aisle, I turned and looked at the back of the store, which would have been parallel to the first leg of my walk. I froze. There was someone in the store, but it was not someone I recognized. He was sitting at the end cap of the aisle, which would have explained why I hadn't seen him when I was walking along the front of the store. He was just sitting on the floor eating junk food and drinking soda. The food he was eating was out of a can, and it looked like he had slashed his hand or something on it. The man looked up at me. I assumed at the moment that he didn't know that anyone was in the store. He stumbled and tried to get up. I turned as quickly as I could and ran to the front of the store. I looked behind me once to see if he had followed me. Then I quickly punched in the code that allowed me to open the door that led to the employee break room, opened it, and turned to pull it closed behind me. I noticed the man sprinting toward the door, but luckily I was able to get it latched before he got there. I quickly went and called the police. The police arrived, but by the time they got to me, they had already arrested the trespasser. He had tried running out the front door and ran away from them when he spotted the cars coming. Apparently, he had hidden himself in the store before the close the previous night. It was only a couple of hours before I came in to begin the donuts, and he thought he would be alone all morning. The whole experience was really creepy, and didn't make it any easier for me to be there in the store by myself going forward. This is a really old story, and I was not working when it happened. As far as I can recall, I was only about 7 years old, but I was in the store at the time. My great-aunt Odie owned a small store out in the country. This was back in the late 70s or so. It was a tiny store that was likely no bigger than a medium-sized living room. The store was made out of that wood that you often see old houses made out of. I don't know if the wood starts out gray in the beginning, but it definitely was by the time I was there. The store was in a very rural area like I mentioned. I always enjoyed going there and getting little 10-cent boxes of candy and a bottle of Pepsi. This was back when they had those really tall pop bottles that you would return to the store after you drank them. Normally we didn't spend a whole lot of time there, but there was one night when I was there, and unfortunately it was the worst of nights to be there. This happened because my dad wanted to go out drinking with other relatives. They had no one to watch my cousin and I, so they asked my aunt if she could watch us at the store. She was more than happy to do that. For the most part, we just stayed up at the counter and talked to our aunt. She was a very interesting and extremely nice lady, and even to this day I enjoy talking to her. We had candy and Pepsi shared between us, so everything was very nice and rosy. At one point in the night, though, a very obviously heavily drunk person walked into the store. This was not unusual. People got drunk all the time in that area after all. It was out in the country in the 70s, and getting drunk just happened to be part of the country outlaw culture. The guy staggered around a little bit. I could tell my aunt wasn't completely happy about him being there. As he staggered around the store, he picked out a drink, opened it, and began drinking it directly in front of us. He then grabbed a stack of chips, opened them too, and began to snack on them as he kept staggering around the store. I could tell my aunt was a bit intimidated. I watched as she reached down and put her hands on the shotgun she kept behind the counter. She was ready to pick it up if she needed to. The guy staggered his way over to us and asked my aunt if he could get a pack of cigarettes. She got them for him and put them down on the counter. He also put his open food and drink there as well. My aunt relaxed a little since he didn't seem to want to cause trouble, and she seemed to have forgotten about the shotgun. While she was ringing things up, the man grabbed his items and turned to leave the store directly. "Hey, you can't leave without paying," my cousin yelled out to the man. Turning back to the counter, the guy quickly dropped the items back onto it. He then reached over, grabbed my cousin by the head and lifted him off the floor. He began shaking my 8-year-old cousin violently and screaming in his face. It was extremely scary to witness. I watched as my aunt quickly grabbed the shotgun and then pointed it at the man. She told him right away to put the kid down, or she would put him down. The man looked at her, and he didn't doubt her, not even in his heavily drunken state. There were plenty of countrywomen who were just as willing to use a shotgun as there were men, too. He did the smart thing and dropped my cousin down. He then grabbed the pack of cigarettes, taking them with him as he left the store without paying for them. My aunt took the gun to the door and watched as the man slowly drove away. Never cross an old woman with a shotgun.